All right, so today we're diving into some Google Cloud documentation, and this is about as dense as it gets. We're talking migrate to virtual machines.
Yeah, you got it. We're going to try to make sense of this whole thing.
So if you've got that stack of docs handy, your shortcut, basically,
Mhm.
we're going to unpack the life cycle of Google's VM migration process.
And hopefully this will help you understand not just the steps, but the why behind those steps, why Google structures things this way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So picture this, you're moving all those virtual machines over to Google Cloud. This documentation is basically a map, right? Like a really detailed map.
Very detailed. And we're going to highlight all those important landmarks, the
Yeah.
ones you can't miss.
Exactly. So first things first, when we say migrate to virtual machines, what is that? Like, give us the quick definition here.
Yeah, so it's what Google calls lift and shift. You're moving your virtual machines with minimal changes. You're picking them up, putting them down somewhere else.
So kind of like, I don't know, just like picking up your house and dropping it in a new neighborhood.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and thankfully you don't have to pack any boxes.
Hopefully not. So what's the secret sauce? What makes this lift and shift thing actually work?
It's all about what Google calls continuous replication. So Google Cloud is constantly creating a copy of your data while everything's running.
Okay.
So there's very little downtime when you actually make the move.
So it's like your stuff's already there by the time you get there.
That's the goal.
I like it. So how does that even work?
Well, it's all managed through the Google Cloud Console. So you've got one place to watch the whole process.
Huh. Oh, very nice. So you can keep an eye on everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it sounds like we're not just talking about like dragging and dropping here. This is like a whole process. So let's break it down. What are the actual steps involved in this migration journey?
Well, the first thing is what Google calls onboarding. And basically, that's just where you're choosing which virtual machines you're going to migrate over.
Okay.
So you're not doing everything at once.
It's like deciding what to pack when you're going on vacation.
Exactly, yeah. You got to prioritize.
Exactly. All right, so we've got our virtual machines. We've picked them out. We've got them ready to go. What's next?
So next up is replication, and this is where the magic really happens. This is that continuous data mirroring I was talking about.
Okay, so break that down. What does that actually mean, data mirroring?
Yeah, so think of it like this. First replication is taking a snapshot of all your data,
Gotcha.
and then incremental replication is like making sure all the changes you make along the way get updated as well.
So like the first one is like packing your suitcase, and then the second one is like calling ahead to the hotel to make sure they have your favorite pillow ready.
There you go.
I like it. All right, what's next?
So once you're all backed up, you got to make sure that your virtual machines are actually going to work on Google Cloud.
Oh, right.
So that's OS adaptations.
So it's like remembering your power adapter when you travel to a different country.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
Got to make sure everything plugs in.
very important.
It is, yeah. Then it's time to figure out where your applications are going to live on Google Cloud. So that's target details, choosing the right Google Cloud project, what instance types you need, what network they should be on, that kind of thing.
So like picking your hotel room type.
Yeah, exactly. Making sure you get a good view.
Right, exactly. Love it.
And this is where it gets really important. Before you pull the trigger, you can actually test everything out. So this is the test clone phase.
So this is like what? Like a test drive before you buy the car.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
They make a copy of your data, let you run your applications on Google Cloud, and make sure everything works the way you expect.
Oh, that's really smart.
Yeah.
So you can work out any kinks before you fully commit.
Exactly.
Smart. So we've test driven it. Everything looks good. We're ready to go. Now what?
Now it's time for the main event, cutover. This is where you finally switch over to Google Cloud. So your old virtual machine takes a quick break.
Okay.
Google finishes copying over the last bit of data, and then bam, you're up and running on Google Cloud.
Wow. So it sounds like this test clone thing that's really important to making this whole cutover process go smoothly.
Yeah, if you don't do it, you could run into problems.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So we're up and running on Google Cloud. Are we done yet? Is that it?
almost. You just got to clean up a little bit.
Okay.
So there's this thing called the finalize phase, where Google deletes all the copies of your data that it was using for replication.
Oh.
But that way you don't get charged for storage you're not using anymore.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
That's always good. Saves money. So it sounds like we've covered all the steps here. Is there anything else people should be aware of with this whole process?
Yeah, it's actually really important to plan this whole thing out carefully.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, especially when it comes to scheduling.
Really? Okay, so it's not just as easy as like flipping a switch and calling it a day.
Not quite. There's a bit more to it than that.
Okay.
It's more like conducting an orchestra.
Interesting. Okay, so what do you mean? Like, what should people be thinking about?
Well, one of the most important things is setting up something called maintenance windows.
Maintenance windows. What are those?
So remember how I mentioned that your old virtual machine takes a break during the cutover phase?
Yeah.
That break has to be scheduled for a specific time.
Oh.
You want to pick a time when your users won't be impacted, like maybe the middle of the night or something.
Oh, right. So you don't want to interrupt anyone who might be using the system.
Exactly. You don't want to interrupt anything important.
Makes sense.
And another thing to keep in mind is something called rollbacks.
Oh, yeah, rollbacks. Those are never fun.
Yeah. And they can be really tricky with migrations like this.
Why is that?
Let's say something goes wrong, right? And you need to go back to your old virtual machine.
Okay.
It's not as simple as just clicking undo. It can get pretty complicated.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, it's not always a straightforward process.
So it's kind of like if you unpacked your suitcase and then had to repack it all over again. It never quite fits the same way.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
So you want to be extra careful and test everything thoroughly to avoid having to do a rollback.
Absolutely. So planning and testing are key.
Very key, yeah.
Got it. So we've covered the what, the how, and even some potential pitfalls. But let's shift gears a bit. I want to talk about the bigger picture.
Sure.
How does migrating your virtual machines fit into your overall cloud strategy?
Right.
Like, is this just a one-off thing or is there more to it?
That's a great question. I think it's important to think of this as just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It's like moving to a new city, right?
Right.
You don't just pick a random apartment. You think about the neighborhood, the commute, all of that stuff.
Right. Like you want to make sure you're near the good coffee shops and the parks and all that.
Exactly. So with cloud migration, you've got to think about things like scalability, security, cost optimization. All of that factors in.
So you're not just moving for the sake of moving. You're moving for a reason.
Exactly.
You've got goals.
Yeah, and you want to make sure this move helps you achieve those goals.
Makes total sense.
And you're not limited by what you could do before. This is a chance to rethink how you're doing things.
So how can people make sure they're thinking about all of this in the right way? Like, what are some practical steps?
I always say start with your why. Why are you moving to the cloud in the first place?
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the logistics and forget about the bigger picture.
Exactly. What are your long-term goals? Once you have that figured out, you can start thinking about the specific applications and workloads you're migrating.
So it's like planning your route based on your destination.
Precisely.
So before we move on, any key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Yeah, I would say really dive into those Google Cloud Docs.
They're dense.
They are,
You are.
but they're important.
But there's a ton of useful information in there.
Okay.
They have specific guides for migrating from VMware, AWS, Azure. Figure out which one applies to you and really study it.
So it's like having a detailed trail map. You know where you're starting, you know where you want to end up.
Right.
Now you just got to figure out the best way to get there.
Exactly. And don't get so caught up in just checking boxes that you forget about those big picture goals we talked about.
So true. Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees.
All right, great advice. So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this. As you're planning your migration, think about how understanding this whole process, like really understanding it, impacts your overall cloud strategy.
That's a good point.
Not just for this migration, but for any future migrations you might have down the road.
Yeah, because this is a journey. This isn't just a one-time thing.
Exactly.
It's about making sure every move you make gets you closer to where you want to be.
Love it.
So yeah, think long-term, think big picture.
Awesome. Well, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into Google Cloud's VM migration process.
It's really about choosing the right time for that switch to happen.
Got it. So like planning a road closure during off-peak hours.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to be stuck in traffic.
Exactly. And what about those rollbacks you mentioned? What makes those so tricky in this whole migration thing?
So let's say something goes wrong and you need to go back to that original virtual machine.
Yeah.
It's not as easy as just hitting undo, you know.
Yeah.
It can be a pretty involved process to like unwind everything.
Oh. So if you've already moved all your furniture into your new place and then realize you hate the neighbors,
Yeah.
it's not that easy to just pick up and leave.
Yeah, something like that.
You've got to hire movers again, unpack all over again.
Exactly. So that's why the test clone phase is so important.
Right. It's all about minimizing risk.
Exactly. You want to catch those problems before they become real problems.
Okay, so we've talked about the what, the how, and even some of those like be careful moments.
Right.
But I want to shift gears for a second and talk about the bigger picture here. How does moving your virtual machines, like how does that actually fit into your overall strategy for using the cloud?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Because it's easy to get caught up in the technical details of it all, you know?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this is just one step in a much larger journey.
It's
It's like,
just,
yeah, it's like moving to a new city, you know? You don't just like pick a random apartment building.
right. There's more to it than that.
You think about the neighborhood, right? You think about the commute. You think about what kind of lifestyle you want.
Exactly. Are there good restaurants nearby?
Exactly. So with migrating to the cloud, you got to think about things like scalability. Can your applications handle more users as your business grows?
Okay.
Security.
Hmm.
Is your data safe in the cloud?
Got it.
Yeah.
Important stuff.
Yeah. And then there's cost optimization. Are you actually saving money by moving to the cloud? Or are you spending more?
Oh, great question. So how can people make sure they're thinking about all of this stuff in the right way?
I think it starts with understanding your why. Why are you moving to the cloud in the first place?
Okay.
What are you hoping to achieve?
It's like making sure you're actually hungry before you order a 5-course meal.
Exactly. Once you know your why, then you can start thinking of the best way to actually make the move.
Okay.
So like think about the specific applications you're migrating. What are their requirements? Do they need to talk to each other? Do they need access to certain databases?
So it's like figuring out which of your belongings need to go in which moving boxes.
Yeah, kind of.
You don't want to just throw everything in randomly.
see?
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, any key takeaways our listeners should remember?
I'd say the biggest one is to really dive deep into that Google Cloud documentation.
Yeah, they're pretty intense,
They can be.
but they're important.
They are. Google has put a ton of work into making sure you have all the information you need.
Okay.
So don't be afraid to really dig in and spend some time with it. Figure out what applies to your specific situation.
So it's like having a super detailed map before you set off on a road trip.
Exactly.
You've got your starting point, you've got your destination, and now you've got turn-by-turn directions.
And as you're planning your route, remember to keep those big picture goals in mind.
Don't get so focused on just getting there that you forget why you're going there in the first place.
Exactly. Think about how this migration can help you achieve your long-term business objectives.
So it's not just about moving, it's about moving with purpose.
Exactly.
All right, great advice. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this. As you're planning your migration, think about how this whole process, like really understanding it inside and out, how that impacts your overall cloud strategy.
Yeah.
Not just for this migration, but for any future migrations you might do down the road.
Right, because this is a journey.
Exactly.
This is not just a one-time thing. You're going to be making decisions about the cloud for years to come.
So true.
So it's important to make sure those decisions are aligned with your long-term vision.
Love it. All right, well, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into Google Cloud's VM migration process. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the technical steps, the strategic decisions, all that good stuff. But for our listeners who are ready to actually start moving their virtual machines, what are some practical things they can do to get started?
Honestly, go back to that Google Cloud documentation we keep talking about.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's worth it. They have really detailed guides for different migration scenarios. Like, are you moving from VMware, AWS, Azure? They've got you covered.
So it's like having a personalized roadmap.
Exactly.
You know where you're starting from, you know where you want to go, and they've got the turn-by-turn directions for how to get there.
Exactly. And as you're planning your route, remember what we talked about earlier. This isn't just about checking boxes. Don't get so focused on the technical details that you lose sight of the big picture.
Right. Don't forget your why.
Exactly. Think about how this migration can help you achieve those big picture business goals you have.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I'd say just remember, migrating to the cloud, it's a journey. There are going to be bumps in the road. But if you plan carefully and keep your goals in mind, it can be a really rewarding experience.
I love it. So to sum it all up, we explored Google Cloud's framework for migrating those virtual machines. We talked about the steps involved, some key things to keep in mind, and how this all ties into your overall cloud strategy.
And hopefully we've given you the confidence to tackle your own migration.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. Right.
Absolutely. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make smart decisions about your technology.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, folks, that's it for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.